The playoffs are here, and this will be the last rest of season wide receiver rankings that you see. Starting off with tier one, we are going to have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. In reality, should probably be Jamar himself, but I have Jamar in my own league, and I'm hoping he sees this video before the game tonight. I'm trying to motivate you, buddy. I really need you to come through in a big-time way for me, especially in the playoffs here. But obviously with Jefferson, you get the massive spike this past week. Darnold looks great, super concentrated offense between just Jefferson and Addison. I'm going over to what we have with Nico Collins leading off tier 3. Again, you could kind of reorder this tier 3 in whatever way you want. Nico, bye week, week 14. But if you go through and if you look at every week that we had previous, as long as he played 50% of the snaps, you had 17, 27, 12, 33, 20, and 19.5 points for Nico Collins. So the man's just been incredibly consistent. You have no digs, so obviously target volume should be very high as well. I'm going over to Puka Nacua, literally insane. Let's remove the game that he gets thrown out because he throws a punch. And honestly, let's remove any game that he doesn't play 50% of snaps. Super easy gauge. 18 points, 18 points, 25 points, 20 points, 17 points, 42 points. It's super concentrated offense here as well, where you're only seeing Puka and Kupp draw targets. So honestly, the more I look at this, the more Puka should be wide receiver 2 in fantasy. Looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown, you've only had one game this season since week 1 with fewer than 10 fantasy points. Obviously, it's an elite offense. The issue is that you're just simply not going to see nearly the same level of passing volume in Detroit as you would in, say, Los Angeles, because the Lions are going to be able to run the ball over and over and over again. And with St. Brown, what's really surprising is you've only had 2 games this year with double-digit targets, but a lot of that goes back to the fact that they are just a run-first offense. Kirk Cousins has looked really bad, and I know this is scaring some people off of Drake London, but if you just remove the game that London gets injured in week 9, and instead you look, just say over the past month, Drake London's averaging like 11, 12 targets a game. So even though Cousins has been very bad, even though maybe you're concerned from a real life perspective, reality, London's dominating targets. He's just been unlucky with touchdowns. He's had some tough matchups. He had to go up against Denver week 11, Chargers week 13, Minnesota week 14. These are tough defenses, but it should get better for the Falcons in the future. And then going over to Cooper Kupp, wide receiver 7. Kupp gives you the one dud game against the New Orleans Saints. But if you look at every game where Kupp's been fully healthy, 32 points, 16 points, 21, 15, 28, 24, and 20. So pretty much can pencil him in for 20 plus fantasy points. It's crazy that both Puka and Kupp are so good at the same time, knowing that there's passing volume and it's an offense that's very concentrated. Tyreek Hill, obviously we've talked about just being a must-start wide receiver every single week. You have Tua. I know a lot of people are upset with us, or at least they were earlier in the year for it, but I think you're now seeing why. You get the 28 fantasy points this week. And I do want to reiterate, you go through and you look at every game that you've had with Tua and Tyreek, Tua playing in full, you've seen 26 points, then only 12, 11.5, 19, 10, but then you get 20, 28 points. So Tyreek Hill has been that wide receiver 1/2 for you at the high end wide receiver 2, low end wide receiver 1. Of course, he's not the tier 1 option you drafted him to be, but still a must start guy every week. I'm going over to Mike Evans, kind of disappointing against the Raiders to only get the 11 fantasy points. Jalen McMillan obviously is the guy that sees all the points with the multiple receiving touchdowns. But historically, we've seen over an incredibly large sample that Evans is going to be able to have a touchdown rate much higher than the league average. And I'm confident in the overall targets we should expect for Evans under the circumstance that you have no Godwin in this offense. And then we recently in the live stream last night had to wave the white flag here with A.J. Brown, where A.J. Brown this season has had 3 games with 20 or more fantasy points. And only one of those has been over the past pretty much 3 months at this point. A.J. Brown has not been anything close to like an elite wide receiver 1. Now, the floor is decent. I mean, if you remove the game against Jacksonville where he only plays 47% of the snaps, really every single game he's guaranteeing you double-digit fantasy points. But the issue is just the target volume has been severely capped where you've had one game with 10 targets this season. And because it's an offense that can run the ball over and over again, going over to CeeDee Lamb, here's what I really need, ladies and gentlemen. I'm fighting it out. I'm battling it out for a bye week in my league. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened with my matchup, but what will guarantee me a bye is if we have Rico Dowdle outscoring CeeDee Lamb this week. So that's what Sal needs. Sal, I'm rooting for you, buddy. You know that. So I'm rooting against CeeDee Lamb. If you go through and look at CeeDee Lamb's underdog projection for tonight, I don't want to focus in too much on tonight's game. Obviously, these are rest of season rankings, but they do currently have CeeDee Lamb higher lower 73.5 total yards and Rico Dowdle higher lower 90.5. So this is what I'm looking at on Underdog. Not because I think it's going to happen, but it's because what I'm rooting for. But of course, if you want to check out any of those picks over on Underdog, you can find the link in the description, comment section. Code FLOCK will hook you up with a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get a free Joe Burrow pick, more than less than half a total yard for the game tonight as well. With T. Higgins in this same contest, it's just tough to talk about these guys. They haven't played. But again, even though you've had Jamar Chase as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy, he's still a phenomenal option looking at the passing volume that you've had in Cincinnati, where Joe Burrow's at the very top of the league in overall passing volume metrics. So it's going to give enough for Higgins. As long as he's healthy, he's a must-start option every week. Terry McLaurin coming off the bye. If you go back and look at what we've had over the past 2 weeks for McLaurin, 21, 27 fantasy points. McLaurin's been really consistent. I mean, since week 3, you've only had one game with fewer than 10 fantasy points. And really since week 3, I want to say you've only had 2 games with fewer than 15 fantasy points. So McLaurin's been great this season, by far and away the best year of his NFL career. I'm looking at Garrett Wilson. With Wilson, again, I want to reiterate, not a great offense, but a super concentrated offense where there'll be only 2 receivers that really touch the ball with Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. You could very easily make an argument to have Adams ahead of Wilson. They're in the same tier. It is up to you. Honestly, you could put Courtland Sutton ahead of, you could put Sutton at the top of this tier if you really wanted to. I mean, with Sutton, he's averaging about 9 targets a game over the past 2 months. But if you're looking at the progression that you've had from Bo Nix, he is vaulting up Courtland Sutton to have his best year of his entire NFL career. Courtland Sutton over the past, say since week 8, since he came back from the goose egg, you've had only 1 game with fewer than 15 fantasy points, and that was at 14.8. And it's not like he's just doing this off of touchdown volume. No, he's doing this off of yards, receptions, super sticky projections you can have going to the future as long as you have Bo Nix continue to elevate this offense. And then going over to Davante Adams, copy and paste exactly what we said with Garrett Wilson. Bad offense, super concentrated, only 2 players are going to touch the ball. If you wanted Adams over Wilson, you do you. Davante Adams definitely been much better than Garrett Wilson over the past 3 weeks. And then going over and looking at George Pickens, obviously we don't get Pickens in week 14. But, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, Pickens has been a super consistent option for you here, where you're looking at a receiver that if you remove the snow game, since Russ has taken over, you've seen 21, 11, 20.5, 17, and 16.5 fantasy points. Now, of course, he isn't drawing a ton of targets. You've only had 2 games this season with double-digit targets, but just a super efficient big play wide receiver that's going to consistently be near the top of the NFL in yards per target and yards per reception. Now, dropping over to our next tier, Ladd McConkey, you can make an argument to have the tier above this. The issue is, obviously, we just don't know the full extent of these Ladd injuries. We don't know if Ladd's going to be playing in week 15. And, I mean, if we were to go through and try to really dial in these rest of season rankings, if a player misses just week 15, that moves them so much lower. Because at least how my league's set up and how your league should be as well. And for the love of God, if it's not, you need to fix it. The fantasy playoffs should be in weeks 15, 16, 17. So if you're missing week 15, it may not matter what you're doing in week 16, 17 if that's what causes us to lose. But Ladd may end up playing. Jerry Jeudy has himself another phenomenal performance. I mean, Jerry Jeudy has had 3 games with fewer than 15 fantasy points, 3 games with more than 15 fantasy points since Jameis has taken over, 0 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points. You get the 40 bomb against Denver 2 weeks back. That was not off of just touchdowns. That was 235 receiving yards. Jerry Jeudy's been really solid. The market share numbers have looked good over the past few weeks as well. But over the past few weeks as well, you've been missing the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL, the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football, in Cedric Tillman. Once Tillman comes back into this offense, we can assume if Jameis has 300 passing yards, Tillman should probably account for about 290 of those. So that wouldn't leave a ton of room for Jerry Jeudy left over here. I'm going over to Juwan Jennings. With Jennings, another spot, we need to wave the white flag. I consistently keep ranking this guy too low. Obviously, it wasn't interesting against Green Bay whenever you had no Purdy. He wasn't interesting against Buffalo when it was the big snow game. But outside of that, the 3 weeks we've had from Jennings, you get 16, 25, and 28 fantasy points since he's returned. I talked about this in the live stream last night, but the most frustrating thing in the world is your boy came through and drafted a lot of Ricky Pearsall as if it was a good idea in Underdog Best Ball drafts this offseason and drafted no Juwan Jennings, where, I mean, Jennings is clearly the freaking dude. Looking over at Malik Neighbors. Neighbors, really high floor. You've had one game with fewer than 10 fantasy points this season. The reason he has that really high floor is he's averaging over 10 targets a game. He's at the very top of the NFL in targets per contest. But again, the reason you have a very low ceiling and why we avoided him in underdog drafts in round 2 this year is the offense is horrendous. If you watched a second of this Giants game, it was a train wreck from start to finish. We haven't seen a touchdown scored by Malik Neighbors since week 3 this season. We haven't seen him score 20 fantasy points in a game since week 4. So Neighbors, he's a high floor option, but a low ceiling option. Going over to Jackson Smith-Njigba, at this point, you have to say he's the wide receiver 1 here in Seattle. I don't think he can get away with it. Over the past 3 weeks, the targets haven't really been there. Over the past 3 weeks, you've seen 16 total targets. He's averaging about 5 targets a game. But he's still had double-digit fantasy points every single one of those weeks. Now, obviously, that's off of insane efficiency. Very hard to project efficiency going into the future. But this is now his 6th week leading the Seattle Seahawks in fantasy points scored. I'm going over to and looking at Jacoby Myers. 3 straight weeks with double-digit fantasy points. Since Devontae Adams has been dealt, you've only had 1 game with fewer than double-digit points here for Myers. But now your quarterback is Desmond Ridder. So it went from bad to ugly to I don't even know what the other term is. Hideous. Could not be worse here in Las Vegas. Obviously, have a lot of volume going over to Brock Bowers as well. Myers been decent, but I just don't realistically see how you could trust him. I'm looking at DJ Moore here. Yes, he had the double-digit points for 4 weeks straight. Yes, he had 26 and 23 points scored in weeks 12 and 13. A lot of y'all got upset with us for ranking him as a low-end wide receiver 2 against the Niners. But again, the massive spike weeks that you had with DJ Moore against Minnesota and Detroit was a 2-game stretch where Caleb Williams averaged 300 passing yards a game. Now, it was a clear collapse against the Niners where Caleb only throws 120, 130 passing yards in this contest. Am I expecting that to be the case going into the future? No, not at all. I think Caleb's going to be better than what he just was. So I think we put DJ Moore about where he was last week. He's a lone wide receiver 2. He's someone that you probably start, but you understand that there is a lower floor than what you're going to see with some of these other receivers. Like you just go back and look at what we had weeks 8, 9, 10. You have a 3-game stretch where DJ Moore is averaging 6 fantasy points a game. Hell, weeks 6, 8, 9, 10. You had a month-long stretch where DJ Moore was consistently fewer than 10 fantasy points. So it's just you're not getting the consistent quarterback play with Caleb. Going over to DK Metcalf, I have no idea why I traded for this dude. Literally, the only reason I think I traded for DK is I looked at him and went, okay, well, he's built exactly how I am. So since he's built exactly how I am, I would dominate in the NFL. So I'm assuming that he's going to be great after he gets over this hamstring. He's been horrendous. We have not had a single 20-point performance since week 3. Now, we can keep saying, over the past month, he's dominating JSN in targets. But frankly, it doesn't matter. Metcalf's leading the team in targets, but JSN is the younger, more efficient receiver that's consistently leading in production. Now, I already know how y'all work. I already know y'all are going to be running to the comment section right now to scream at me that Jordan Addison is way too low in these rankings. And coming from somebody who planted their flag on the Jordan Addison Island this offseason, that made Addison their number 1 player drafted on Underdog for a large stretch of the offseason, I pray to God you're right. I pray to God that I am wrong and Addison's too low in these rankings and Addison's transitioning over to being a high-end wide receiver 2 every single week, regardless of the matchup. My thing with Addison is obviously as the 40-point performance this past week. Phenomenal. And really helping my underdog teams. My underdog teams are crushing it. At the time of this recording, I'm advancing almost 40 Best Ball Mania teams. Insane. But if you look at the games where Addison's played with a touchdown versus without, games without a touchdown, 6, 6, 9, 4, 4, 9 fantasy points. Games with a touchdown, 22, 16, 15, 30, 39. Addison at this point is very much a touchdown or bust wide receiver. Doesn't see a ton of volume. Obviously, if you get 3 touchdowns, you're going to be great, which I really hope we get more games like this in the future. It's just hard to project. Harrison's also been very much a touchdown or bust wide receiver. We go over and look at Marvin Harrison. Games with no touchdown, 1, 5, 5, 3, 7, 8 fantasy points. Games with a touchdown, 29, 17, 15, 23, 16, and 17 fantasy points. So touchdown or bust wide receiver is pretty much the entire tier here. You go over and you can look at Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers maybe gives you a little bit of a higher floor. With Flowers, you haven't had double-digit targets since week 8. This is going to be a team with a ton of rushing touchdowns, of course. Devonta Smith, you haven't had double-digit targets since week 3. I started him this past week. Thank God we got the receiving touchdown. The issue is very similar to A.J. Brown. This is an offense that's just going to run the ball over and over and over again. Looking at Jalen Waddle, I left Jalen Waddle on my bench. He sets a season-high 12 targets, season-high 9 receptions. I mean, a season-high 20 fantasy points, and you don't even see the receiving touchdown. You probably have positive touchdown regression coming for Jalen Waddle soon, where this season so far, he's only had 2 total touchdowns. But again, the volume's not consistently there. Like, honestly, we may move Brian Thomas ahead of Waddle and Devonta Smith. Obviously, we'll keep these rankings up to date on flogfantasy.com every single day going into the future. I think one thing that we're going to update is move Brian Thomas ahead of Waddle and Smith. Brian Thomas, much worse offense, but arguably same level talent, phenomenal receivers. And Brian Thomas has way less target competition, so he should just see a much higher floor in terms of the raw receptions. Going over and looking at Jamison Williams, Jamison hasn't had the touchdown in a while, but Jamison's actually showed a higher floor in these games where he doesn't score than I was initially expecting. Like, Jamison over the past 3 weeks with no touchdown has actually been averaging over 7 targets a game. The target volume that we have seen over the past 3 weeks is actually comparable to what you're seeing with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, obviously, I'd way rather have St. Brown over Jamison, but I am kind of changing my mind here where previously we were saying, oh, okay, if the long receiving touchdowns there with Jamison, he's going to look great. And if it's not there, it's going to just be an absolute debacle, which that's still in the range of outcomes. You go back to week 3, he gives you 1 fantasy point. You go back to week 7, he gives you half a fantasy point. But the floor does look like it's raising with Jamison. Darnell Mooney, you get the 20 fantasy points this week, which is great. The last time you had 20 fantasy points was back when Cousins had the, 500 passing yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mooney looks good, but Drake London is dominating the targets. Mooney's going to be up and down. Calvin Ridley, I think actually can be lowered in these rankings based off the news that we get with Levis. Ridley is the clear guy over Nick Westbrook-Ikine. If you fell for Nick Westbrook, I don't know what to tell you. The clearest trap I've ever seen of all traps. Ridley's been the guy with the target volume. Ridley's the guy that we've seen the large sample with. Ridley's the guy that's getting paid. And I'd say Ridley's probably going to continue to lead this team in targets. Now, obviously, Ridley's run a little bit bad with touchdowns, where you've only had 3 touchdowns so far this season with Ridley, but that's always the concern that you have with these bad offenses. This is statement ranking with Jayden Reed. I have no idea how the hell you could ever start Jayden Reed. Like, I'm done with it. This dude has had 1 game with more than 6 targets this season. Now, it was 8 targets against the Minnesota Vikings in week 4. And we've had no Romeo Doubs lately. You get the goose egg against the Detroit Lions in week 14 with no Romeo Doubs here. So, I don't know. It's tough to rely on Reed. Going over to DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins does see a considerable amount of targets against the Los Angeles Chargers. I mean, he looks like he's Mahomes' guy. The issue is the passing volume is not consistent in this offense. Chris Olave is extremely difficult to rank at this point. One, with Olave, he may not come back this season. If I was him, I wouldn't come back. There's no reason to. His team's not playing for anything. And two, even if he does come back, you have no Derek Carr. So you're probably in a situation very similar to like Brian Thomas, where it's like, cool, you're the only guy in the offense. You're going to see every single target. But you're in a garbage offense, so we can't really be excited about you regardless. Going over to Khalil Shakir here. If you are looking at Shakir, yes, you get the 21 fantasy points. This is the first game all season where you've seen 20 fantasy points for Shakir. It's funny. I know a lot of people go into the comment section, go, oh, Mason keeps disrespecting Shakir. Mason keeps disrespecting Shakir. Let's let the numbers do the talking here. First game with 20 fantasy points. And what needs to happen for it? 6 Josh Allen touchdowns. So here, let me be on record. If going into the future, you told me, Mason, Keon Coleman's not coming back, Dalton Kincaid's not coming back, and Josh Allen's going to average 6 touchdowns a game for the next 3 weeks, I will throw in the towel and I'll rank Khalil Shakir as a must-start option. However, what I would expect is if Keon and Kincaid come into this offense, the targets are going to be dispersed. And Shakir probably goes back to the, 11 fantasy points. 12 fantasy points. Which if you're in the playoffs, I don't really know if that's moving the needle for you. Looking at, say, Deebo Samuel, I don't know how you could ever start this dude. One game this season with 20 fantasy points. Honestly, the only reason he's on this list is because his name. Keenan Allen, you've had 3 games this year with 20 fantasy points. What's hilarious is it's feast or famine with Keenan. Pun intended. You've had 3 games with 10 fantasy points or more, and all of them went for over 20. So Keenan's either going to blow up or Keenan's going to give you absolutely nothing. And there's going to be no in between. And obviously a lot of it hinges on the passing volume that you're going to see with Caleb. But you do have Rome expanding, where Rome had the 2 receiving touchdowns this past week. And obviously Rome is going to be somebody that you're having to compete with regardless. But again, I want to remind y'all what I am rooting for this week, or I'm rooting for tonight in tonight's game. For me to get the bye, we effectively need CeeDee Lamb to be outscored by Rico Dowdle. So I may submit this underdog pick'em, just so we have some extra stakes on it. But yeah, they have Rico Dowdle higher, lower, 90.5 total yards, and CeeDee Lamb higher, lower, 73.5 total yards. If you want to find that pick'em, you can in the description, in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get a free Joe Burrow pick for tonight's game, more than less than half total yard. But I think that's all I got for you. Really appreciate you, and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.